visits in the autumn of 1952 at Oak Ridge Associated Universities in Tennessee, one of the primary medical research institutions adjacent to the government's wartime and post-war nuclear infrastructure. A pediatric ward log recorded an unusual admission. The patient, identified in surviving intake documents only by the initials ML, was a child between 7 and 9 years of age, brought in by a single accompanying adult whose relationship to the child was noted as custodial, non-parental. The admitting nurse, Eleanor Voss, a registered nurse with 11 years of clinical experience, including wartime triage postings in the Pacific Theater, completed the standard intake assessment. What she recorded in that assessment would, within weeks, be partially redacted, and within 6 months, removed entirely from the accessible ward file. The records that remain fragments preserved in a secondary nursing log that was never formally cross-referenced with the main case file indicate that ML presented with a constellation of symptoms that did not correspond to any diagnostic category available at the time. The child's skin exhibited what Voss described as asymmetric discoloration in irregular patches, not consistent with burn pattern, bruising, or known dermatological presentation. The hair was partially absent in a distribution she noted as non-follicular in origin, suggesting process distinct from alopecia. The child's gums showed minor but persistent bleeding, and the lymph nodes along the neck and jaw were measurably enlarged. Taken individually, each symptom might have been attributed to a range of known conditions. Taken together, in the specific configuration Voss documented, they formed something she herself described in a private notation as a presentation I have not encountered in literature or practice. What stands out, examining the nursing logs from that period, is not the strangeness of the symptoms in isolation, it is the precision with which Voss recorded them. She was not a speculative writer. Her intake notes throughout her career are characterized by conservative, methodical language. She documented what she observed. She did not interpret, and yet in the secondary log, in entries running across 4 consecutive days in late October 1952, she returned again and again to the same question, framed each time in slightly different terms. Why did the standard exposure protocols not apply here, and who had authorized the child's admission without a referring physician on record? That last detail, the absence of a referring physician, is corroborated by a second source. The ward administrator at the time, whose name appears in institutional records as H. Carver, signed a notation acknowledging that ML's file lacked standard referral documentation. Carver's notation was brief and bureaucratic, indicating only that the gap would be addressed through appropriate channels. There is no subsequent record of those channels being engaged. The referral section of ML's file, according to an index notation made in 1958 during a routine archival review, was listed as missing origin undetermined. Eleanor Voss continued treating ML for 17 days. During that period, the child's condition neither clearly improved nor deteriorated in any linear pattern. The records indicate instead a kind of oscillation. Certain symptoms would recede for a period of 36 to 48 hours, then return with marginal intensification. The skin discoloration shifted in location. The lymph node enlargement fluctuated without obvious correlation to any treatment being administered. Voss noted in the secondary log that the child received visits from individuals she identified only as the accompanying personnel, distinct from the custodial adult present at intake individuals who came during off-peak ward hours and whose presence was not logged in the main visitor registry. By the end of November, ML was transferred. The destination recorded in the main file is listed as outpatient continuation, facility unspecified. In the secondary log, Voss wrote a single line following the transfer entry. No discharge summary was completed. I was told not to prepare one. She did not elaborate on who had told her this, or through what mechanism the instruction had been delivered. The line sits in the log without context, surrounded by routine entries about other patients' medication adjustments, vital sign recordings, shift handoff notes as though it were itself just another clinical observation. It was, in a narrow technical sense, precisely that. Voss remained employed at the facility through 1955. She transferred to a community hospital in rural Virginia the following year. In a brief professional profile published in a regional nursing association newsletter in 1961, She listed her specialties and her previous postings. Oak Ridge Associated Universities was not among them. The omission may mean nothing. Professional summaries of that era were often incomplete, particularly for nurses whose work had overlapped with government-adjacent research environments, where discretion was not merely encouraged, but structurally embedded in employment agreements. Voss would not have been unusual in choosing not to reference that posting. But the absence, like the missing referral documentation, like the unlogged visitors, like the transfer to no named facility, it accumulates. It sits alongside the other absences and, without declaring anything, begins to suggest a shape. The case of ML would be unremarkable if it were singular. A single unusual pediatric presentation, a single set of administrative irregularities, a single nurse who left a posting without listing it on her professional record, none of these individually constitute a pattern. They constitute, at most, an anomaly. And anomalies, in the environment of post-war American nuclear medicine, were not rare. The entire field was built on anomaly. The entire apparatus of Oak Ridge, the research divisions, the medical protocols, the exposure thresholds, the treatment frameworks had been assembled in real time, in the absence of precedent, by people who were themselves encountering phenomena for which no prior framework existed. What Eleanor Voss encountered in October 1952 may have been one iteration of something that was already, by that point, quietly repeating itself across a dispersed network of facilities, wards, and intake logs, most of which have never been cross-referenced, and some of which no longer exist in any accessible archive. The question is not whether ML's case was real. The records, fragmentary as they are, confirm that it was. The question is what it was a case of, and whether anyone, at any level of the system that processed that child's admission and authorized that child's transfer to an unnamed facility, ever arrived at an answer they were permitted to record. Part 2. The records indicate that Oak Ridge Associated Universities was not the only institution handling pediatric cases with atypical radiation-adjacent presentations during the early 1950s. Between 1950 and 1955, at least 3 other facilities with documented ties to the Atomic Energy Commission's medical research programs admitted patients in similar age ranges under circumstances that share, in retrospect, a notable structural resemblance to the ML case. Incomplete referral documentation, non-standard symptom profiles, and transfer records that either name no destination or name a destination that cannot be verified against any known institutional registry of that period. At the University of Cincinnati Hospital, which maintained a formal research relationship with the AEC beginning in 1950, internal ward correspondence from 1951 and 1952 references a subset of pediatric patients described in aggregate terms, never individually, as presenting with exposure sequelae requiring non-standard monitoring intervals. The phrase non-standard monitoring appears 3 times across 2 separate memos authored by different physicians. Neither memo explains what the standard monitoring interval was, nor what circumstances warranted deviation from it. A follow-up research summary that was, according to a 1953 index entry, intended to document outcomes for this patient subset was never completed. The index entry notes the summary as deferred pending protocol clarification. No subsequent entry records the clarification being provided. At Massachusetts General Hospital, a ward log from the pediatric division, one of the few from this period to survive intact through multiple archival transfers, contains a notation from February 1952 describing a child admitted with dermal and lymphatic presentations of uncertain etiology, no trauma history confirmed. The attending nurse's notes reference a consultation request submitted to the hematology division. That consultation, according to the log, was never fulfilled. The requesting notation sits in the record without a response entry, which in standard hospital record-keeping of the era would have been irregular. A response, even a denial, even a redirection, would typically have generated a corresponding notation. The silence in the record is itself a form of data. What stands out across these cases is not any single detail, but the consistency of the administrative pattern surrounding them. The symptom profiles vary in their specifics. Not every case involves the same dermal presentation. Not every case documents the same lymphatic involvement, but the procedural circumstances share a quality that is difficult to attribute entirely to institutional coincidence. Missing referrals, unnamed transfer destinations, consultations requested and not answered, summaries deferred and not revisited. These are not the markers of routine medical error or bureaucratic inefficiency. They are the markers of a process that was being managed in ways that did not generate a complete paper trail, whether by design or by the operation of informal institutional pressures that achieve the same result without requiring explicit instruction. If you've been following these patterns across different facilities and time periods, you'll begin to notice that the gaps are not random. They cluster around specific procedural moments: the referral, the consultation, the discharge, the summary, which are precisely the moments at which a case would typically become legible to anyone reviewing the record from outside. What is absent is not incidental detail. What is absent is the connective tissue that would allow an outside observer to reconstruct what happened. The timeline becomes difficult to ignore when laid against the broader chronology of American nuclear testing and its expansion during this period. Between 1951 and 1952 alone, the Nevada test site conducted 23 nuclear detonations under Operation Buster Jangle and Operation Tumbler Snapper. Troops were present during and immediately following several of these detonations as part of deliberate military exposure exercises. Civilian populations in downwind communities, primarily in Nevada and Utah, received no formal notification of elevated fallout risk. The AEC's public communications during this period consistently characterized the testing program as safe, the radiation levels as within acceptable thresholds, and any health concerns raised by civilian observers as either unfounded or the product of misunderstanding. The children admitted to these facilities were not, in most documented cases, the children of military personnel. The custodial context noted in intake records, where they are noted at all, suggests civilian origins. In the ML case, the accompanying adult's relationship was recorded as non-parental and custodial, a bureaucratic category that in 1952 could encompass a range of arrangements, including state guardianship, institutional placement, or informal custody. The child's residential history prior to admission is not recorded anywhere in the surviving fragments of the case file. Where ML had been before arriving at Oak Ridge in October 1952 is not a question the records answer. Similar reports began appearing in the professional literature of the period, though not in the form that would make them easily recognizable. A 1953 paper published in a specialized hematology journal discussed, in aggregate and anonymized terms, a cluster of pediatric patients presenting with leukopenic trends and integumentary irregularities of undetermined cause. The paper's authors noted that the cases shared no apparent epidemiological link in terms of geographic proximity or family contact, and concluded that the presentation was likely idiopathic, a medical term meaning, in effect, that the cause was unknown. The paper did not reference radiation exposure as a possible etiological factor, despite the symptom profile being consistent with what would later be formally characterized, in the wake of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki medical studies, as subacute radiation syndrome. The absence of that reference is, in itself, an observation worth holding. By 1953, the medical literature on radiation effects in human populations was not non-existent. The Joint Commission for the Investigation of the Effects of the Atomic Bomb in Japan had been operating since 1945. Its findings, while unevenly disseminated and subject to significant classification constraints, had entered the biomedical community in sufficient form that a hematologist reviewing a cluster of children with leukopenic trends and integumentary irregularities would have had access, conceptually if not documentarily, to the relevant framework. The decision not to invoke that framework in the published paper may have been a genuine scientific judgment. It may also have been something else, a choice made within an environment in which certain etiological hypotheses carried institutional consequences that purely scientific ones did not. The data does not fully align with any single explanatory model. That is, perhaps, the most precise thing that can be said about it. The symptom profiles are suggestive but not definitive. The administrative patterns are unusual but not provably coordinated. The timeline is resonant but not conclusive. What the accumulation of cases does, taken together, is shift the probability distribution of coincidence. One facility with incomplete records is a gap. 3 facilities with structurally similar gaps, clustered in a specific historical window, adjacent to a specific program of activities with known radiological consequences, begin to constitute something that resists the word coincidence without quite reaching the word conspiracy. It constitutes instead a pattern, and patterns in the documentary analysis of institutional behavior are the primary unit of evidence when direct documentation has not survived or has not been permitted to survive. Part 3. The Atomic Energy Commission, established by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, was not merely a regulatory body. It was, from its inception, an entity that combined the functions of scientific oversight, industrial management, national security coordination, and public communication within a single administrative structure, a combination that created, by architectural design, significant capacity for information management across multiple domains simultaneously. Its medical research program, operating through a network of contracted universities and hospitals, was formally described as an effort to understand the biological effects of radiation for purposes of worker safety and public health advancement. The structure of that program, however, was not organized to maximize the flow of information outward. It was organized, as the contractual language of several university agreements from the early 1950s makes clear upon review, to ensure that findings remained within a controlled review process before any external dissemination occurred. This is not a characterization imposed retrospectively. The language of the AEC's own internal policy documents from this period, those that have been declassified through Freedom of Information Act proceedings over the past 4 decades, reflects an explicit concern with what the agency termed premature publication. A 1951 internal memorandum from the EA's Division of Biology and Medicine, obtained through FOIA and now held in the National Security Archive, directed contracted research institutions to submit all findings related to human exposure studies for internal review prior to submission to any external journal. The stated rationale was quality assurance and security screening. The operational effect was a mechanism by which findings that were inconvenient, ambiguous, or politically sensitive could be delayed, modified, or quietly set aside. Eleanor Voss, completing her nursing log entries in the autumn of 1952, was almost certainly unaware of the specific policy framework within which her institution was operating. She was a clinical practitioner, not an administrator or a researcher. Her access to the contractual and policy architecture of the AEC's medical research program would have been effectively non-existent. What she had access to was the ward, the patients, the logs, and the instructions she received, instructions whose origins she documented, without being in a position to trace them to their source. The section of the main case file pertaining to ML's treatment protocol was, as noted in the 1958 archival review, found to be incomplete. What the archival review did not note, and what becomes visible only by cross-referencing the review index against the secondary nursing log, is that the sections found to be incomplete correspond precisely to the periods Voss described most specifically in her private notations. The first week of treatment, during which she documented the asymmetric skin discoloration and the non-follicular hair loss, and the final 3 days before transfer, during which she noted the visits from unlogged personnel. The correspondence is exact. The portions of the record that most directly substantiate the unusual nature of the case are the portions that did not survive into the accessible archive. No official explanation was provided for the gaps identified in the 1958 review. The reviewer's notation recorded the incompleteness and moved on. There was no investigation, no supplementary inquiry, no effort to reconstruct what had been lost, or to determine whether the loss was accidental or deliberate. In the bureaucratic culture of mid-century American institutional medicine, this was not necessarily unusual. Its records were routinely incomplete. Archival standards were inconsistent. Files were lost to flooding, to fire, to simple neglect. But the specificity of what was absent, the targeted nature of the gaps, does not sit comfortably alongside explanations rooted in ordinary archival attrition. The section was later removed, or was never fully incorporated into the central file, at a moment that cannot now be precisely determined. What can be determined is that by the time anyone outside the immediate institutional environment would have had reason to look for it, it was already gone. Similar dynamics appear in the documentary record of the Cincinnati program. A congressional inquiry conducted in 1971, following journalistic exposure of the AACC's human radiation experiments, sought to obtain complete patient records for the Cincinnati hospital study population. The hospital's response, documented in the congressional record, indicated that a portion of the patient files from the early 1950s could not be located. The portion that could not be located corresponded, according to internal hospital correspondence submitted to the inquiry, to patients in younger age categories, specifically patients under the age of 12. The correspondence did not explain why files for younger patients were disproportionately absent. The inquiry did not press the question with sufficient specificity to obtain an explanation on the record. The timeline of that inquiry is itself worth examining. By 1971, nearly 2 decades had elapsed since the admissions in question. The nurses and ward administrators who had handled those cases had, in many instances, moved to other institutions, retired, or died. The institutional memory that would have allowed someone to reconstruct the administrative decisions surrounding those files was largely inaccessible. What remained were the documents, and specifically, the absence of documents in precisely the categories that would have been most informative. What connects these institutional moments, Oak Ridge in 1952, Cincinnati's deferred summary, Massachusetts General's unanswered consultation, the 1971 inquiry's missing pediatric files, is not a single directive or a single decision-maker. The connections are structural. They emerge from the operation of an institutional environment in which certain categories of information were systematically less likely to be preserved, less likely to be published, and less likely to be made available to anyone whose professional interests were not aligned with the program's continued operation. That environment did not require explicit coordination to produce consistent results. It required only the consistent application of institutional incentives across a distributed network of facilities, all of which understood, at some level of organizational awareness, where the boundaries of permitted inquiry lay. The data does not fully align with a narrative of deliberate and centrally coordinated suppression. It aligns more precisely with something quieter and more systemic. A culture in which certain questions were not asked, certain records were not preserved, and certain cases children arriving at facilities without proper referrals, treated by protocols that generated no discharge summaries, transferred to destinations that could not be named, were processed through institutional channels in ways that ensured they would leave the smallest possible legible trace. Eleanor Voss left a trace. She left it in a secondary log that was not formally cross-referenced, and therefore did not receive the administrative attention that the main case file received. It survived, in fragments, not because anyone protected it, but because no one found it important enough to remove. Part 4. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds certain categories of mid-20th century American medical records. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of displacement, the silence that occurs when something that should be present is absent, and the absence itself has been processed through enough institutional layers that it no longer registers as a gap, but as a condition of the archive. The researcher who approaches these records without prior knowledge of what they should contain may not notice that anything is missing. The file is thin, but files are often thin. The referral section is blank, but referral sections are sometimes blank. The transfer destination is unnamed, but transfers were sometimes informal. Each absence, evaluated individually, can be absorbed into the texture of ordinary archival incompleteness. It is only when the absences are mapped across cases, when the specific location of each gap is charted against the specific location of gaps in other files, from other institutions, in the same historical window, that the pattern becomes visible. The pattern does not declare itself, it accumulates. In the years following the period under examination, the scientific and legal understanding of what happened in American nuclear medicine during the late 1940s and early 1950s developed slowly, unevenly, and largely through the efforts of researchers, journalists, and affected individuals who encountered institutional resistance at nearly every stage of their inquiry. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established by President Clinton in 1994, conducted the most comprehensive formal review of this history attempted by any government body. Its final report, submitted in 1995, documented hundreds of experiments involving human subjects, many of whom had not provided informed consent, many of whom were drawn from vulnerable populations, prisoners, patients with serious illness, individuals in institutional care, and some of whom were children. The committee's report is a substantial document. It is also, by the committee's own acknowledgement, incomplete. The records available to the committee were those that had survived 4 decades of archival attrition, administrative reorganization, and, in some cases, active document destruction. The committee noted that certain categories of records from the early 1950s were either entirely absent or represented only by fragmentary materials. It noted this without being in a position to determine, in most cases, whether the absence reflected loss, destruction, or the simple failure of documentation that may have occurred at the point of origin in the ward, at the moment of intake, in the decision not to prepare a discharge summary. The ML case is not referenced in the committee's report. This absence is not itself unusual. The committee reviewed hundreds of cases and could not have achieved comprehensive coverage of all relevant files, particularly those preserved only in secondary logs at the institutional level. But the case fits, structurally and chronologically, within the population of cases the committee was examining. A child admitted without a referring physician, treated by a nurse who was subsequently instructed not to prepare a discharge summary, transferred to an unnamed facility, whose primary case file was subsequently found to be incomplete in exactly the sections documenting the most unusual aspects of the presentation. This is not a case that falls outside the committee's framework of concern. It is a case that simply was not surfaced to it. Eleanor Voss died in 1979 in Charlevoix, Virginia, where she had worked at a community hospital for more than 20 years. Her professional record in that final posting was, by all available accounts, unremarkable in the specific sense of the word. It did not attract remark. She was a competent, experienced nurse who retired without distinction and without incident. There is no record of her having spoken publicly about her time at Oak Ridge, no record of her having contacted any of the journalists or researchers who, beginning in the late 1960s and intensifying through the 1970s, were beginning to document the history of the AEC's human research programs. Whether she was aware of those efforts, whether she had considered speaking to anyone, whether she made a decision to remain silent or simply lived within a silence that had already formed around her by the time anyone thought to ask, none of this is documented. What is documented is the secondary log. It exists. The fragments that contain her notations about ML exist. They constitute a record of observation made by a trained clinical practitioner in real time, describing a child whose symptoms did not match any known presentation, in circumstances that the practitioner herself found procedurally irregular, within an institution that was contractually embedded in the AEC's medical research infrastructure at the peak of the post-war nuclear testing program. That is what the record contains. It does not contain an explanation. It does not contain a diagnosis. It does not contain the name of the child, the name of the accompanying adult, the name of the facility to which the child was transferred, or the name of any of the unlogged personnel who visited the ward during off-peak hours. If you have followed the accumulation of these cases, Oak Ridge, Cincinnati, Massachusetts General, the 1971 inquiry, the 1995 committee's acknowledged gaps, you will notice that the question shifts over time. In 1952, the question was clinical. What was wrong with this child, and why did the symptoms not align with any known diagnostic category? By 1958, the question had become archival. Why were these sections of the record incomplete? By 1971, the question had become institutional. Why were the pediatric files disproportionately absent? By 1995, the question had become historical. How many such cases existed, and what happened to the people at their centre? The question that remains the one that the records, in their current state, Do not answer is not about any individual case. It is about the relationship between the institutional infrastructure that processed these cases and the clinical reality those cases represented. Children were admitted. Nurses observed. Records were made and then unmade. Transfers were completed to destinations that have no paper presence in any accessible registry. The system that accomplished all of this, the intake protocols, the research contracts, the review mechanisms, the archival practices, the informal cultures of institutional discretion, functioned with sufficient consistency across sufficient geography and sufficient time to produce a recognizable pattern without ever generating, as far as any current archive reveals, a document that explicitly coordinated it. That is, in some respects, the most precise observation available. The pattern exists without a blueprint. The results are consistent without a directive. The absences are specific without being demonstrably deliberate. Eleanor Voss noted, in her final entry concerning ML, that the child had, in the days before transfer, begun to show a partial reversal of the skin discoloration, a slight normalization in one of the affected areas. She recorded this in the same measured observational language she had used throughout. She did not interpret it as improvement. She did not interpret it as anything. She recorded what she saw, as she had been trained to do, and left the interpretation to whoever would read the file after her. The file, as it exists now, does not record whether anyone did.